Thanks for being here. Now, for folks not familiar with the Local Catch Network, we're a community of practice that supports and catalyzes local and community-based seafood systems throughout North America. And just a few weeks ago, the Local Catch Network, we released our first strategic plan in which we laid out some of our core focus areas and our goals and strategies for the next 5 years. And today's forum on USDA and seafood is directly tied to those strategies. And specifically our focus area of facilitating change in the larger seafood system. So if you'd like to learn more about our strategic plan, we've got it available on the Local Catch Network website, so you can read through it there. Now, we've got 3 primary goals for today's forum. The first is to build awareness about USDA programs and grant funding that's available to the seafood sector. The second is to encourage information sharing and collaboration between local catch members. There's just so much we can learn from each other. And so really, we want to create space to be sharing and learning. And lastly, we want to help empower all of you to be able to advocate for and engage in decisions and policies that impact the future of our seafood system. And we'll be providing more information about ways you can do that. Now, like I said, today's forum is focused on USDA and seafood, and we're focusing on the USDA because USDA plays such a critical role in shaping and strengthening our country's food system. And I think we can all agree that community-based fisheries are a really important part of our country's food system. Now, the USDA can also be confusing and challenging for folks in the seafood sector to navigate. It can often feel like it's a place maybe we're not welcome or can seem unfamiliar. So, we're hoping to address some of those sort of challenges that members of the seafood community have come across and ways they've gotten through them. Because as you're about to hear, it can be done, and the benefits and impacts of USDA funding can be really significant and really tremendous. So we're thrilled and honored to have a panel of experts and fishing community leaders with us today. They're going to speak to USDA grant programs that are available to the seafood sector, some of the success stories and lessons learned in applying for USDA grant funding, and opportunities to increase the USDA's investment in the seafood sector. And after our panelists speak, there's going to be time for questions and discussion. And that's when we really want to hear from all of you regarding your own experiences pursuing USDA grant funding. We know there are a lot of you out there that have looked into this, have applied, maybe successfully or not, and definitely want to hear what you've learned through those experiences. You'll be able to submit your questions one of 2 ways, either using the chat or by raising your hand, and we'll call on you and ask you to unmute yourself. And again, I'll explain that more when we get to the Q&A portion. But until then, we do ask that everyone please stay on mute so that everyone has a chance to hear our panelists and what they have to share. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Linda Benkin from the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association and the Alaska Sustainable Fisheries Trust in Sitka, Alaska. She's going to share why her organizations first pursued USDA grant funding, what they learned through the application process, and their ongoing efforts to make USDA grant funding more accessible to others in the seafood sector. So with that, I will turn it over to Linda.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you all for taking time to attend today. We're really excited by your interest and also very excited to be sharing with you the information that we have in the study and how to increase USDA support for America's nutritious seafood in general and wild capture fisheries in particular. I'm sure some of you have been working for years to do just that, and some of you have experience as seafood producers working with or trying to work with USDA, and we really look forward to learning from you as well. One of the best parts of being a commercial fisherman, and there are many, is the opportunity to not only eat amazing seafood, but also to share the amazing seafood we harvest and deliver, in my case, deliver into Alaska's small rural communities. We know it is one of the best proteins in the world, and yet despite the well-recognized health benefits and the overall deliciousness, most Americans are either not eating much seafood or eating imported seafood. In fact, 62 to 65% of the seafood consumed in our country is imported, and over 70% of US harvested seafood is exported. And very few Americans know who caught the fish they eat. On top of that, salmon fishermen in Alaska are currently paid the same price they were paid for their fish over 20 years ago. And we all know that the cost of operation has increased significantly since then. In short, Americans are not eating US seafood, and fishermen are not earning a living wage for the incredible seafood that we catch. Something's very wrong. I first heard these statistics some years ago, and our organization wanted to change them. Americans should have access to US seafood. They should know where their fish are caught, and our coastal fishermen should be thriving. Our organization launched the first community supported fishery in Alaska and one of the first in the country. We immediately learned that the infrastructure for value-added production and distribution was limited, and the access to grants or low-cost capital to change that was even more scarce. We turned to USDA, after all, fish is food, and started combing through programs to identify opportunities that work for our small-scale fisheries. What we found was very little, and that even when we found a request for proposals that seemed to include seafood, the application from qualifying criteria to require deliverables and metrics were often a poor fit. Did we produce 51% of the seafood we wanted to market? Well, we harvested it, but worked with a fishermen's cooperative to process it. Did we get our own fish back? Hard to say. Were we a producers cooperative? No, we were a nonprofit organization of fishermen, producers working with a processing cooperative. To avoid misapplying, we called USDA representatives and followed their directions, only to be disqualified for applying in the wrong category. Once we were disqualified from a food hub RFP because the USDA reviewer considered seafood to be only one product. The hub application required multiple products. Of course, that's like saying produce is one product or dairy is only one product, but I'm sure you get that. To be clear, we have had some meaningful successes with USDA, and they've made a tremendous difference for our organization and the work we are doing. Also, throughout the many arduous application attempts, USDA employees have been helpful and supportive, just with very, very little background in fisheries and limited flexibility in the application process to make our fisheries a fit. And that is what we want to change. As the report shows, seafood is currently receiving 0.52% of USDA investment from key programs, and wild capture fisheries are securing about 3% of the 0.52%. We need people at USDA who understand US fisheries and are eager to provide the same support to fishermen and seafood processors as is currently provided to US farmers and ranchers. We need to rethink the farm bill into a food bill and float all boats, so to speak. We're advocating for a seafood office at USDA per Senator Sullivan's bill, an extension of USDA grants and loans to seafood per Senator Murkowski and King's Working Waterfronts bill. The way has been charted, and this report helps navigate the route to make USDA seafood friendly. And that's important. US seafood is valuable. Alaska's seafood industry alone has an annual $15 billion economic impact on the US. With investment from USDA, we can increase that impact and increase the access of Americans to US seafood. We're eager to work with you to realize those benefits, and again, deeply appreciate your attendance here today and engagement on this issue. With that, I'll turn this back to Elizabeth to give other panelists a chance to speak.
Thank you, Linda. We're now going to hear from Josh Stoll, who I know a lot of you know already, but Josh is from the University of Maine Social Oceans Lab, and he's a co-founder, longtime leader of the Local Catch Network. And he's also one of the lead authors for an article published last month in Frontiers and Sustainable Food Systems. And the research is focused on USDA grant funding as it pertains to seafood. So Josh is going to just do a brief overview presentation, sharing what they learned. So with Josh.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to be part of this conversation today. As Elizabeth just said, my name's Josh Stoll, and I'm faculty in the School of Marine Sciences, and have the privilege of helping to support a research team that focuses on issues related to ocean and coastal policy. And over the last 10 years or so, our team has become particularly interested in the role that seafood plays in our broader food system. And we were approached by the Alaska Sustainable Fisheries Trust and Linda Bankin and Company to work on a project to understand USDA's grant funding support for the seafood sector by specifically evaluating its recent grant-making history within 4 agencies within the department. And I think Linda did an amazing job of helping to set the context for this conversation today. But just to reemphasize that point, and from the perspective that I'm coming from, this conversation about the role that seafood plays in our broader food system has gotten quite a bit of policy attention over the last few years, and it's amplified in a number of different policy documents, including NOAA's National Seafood Strategy, which specifically calls on NOAA and others to increase the amount of American seafood on Americans' plates. A recent study by GAO on the National School Lunch Program that points out that only 1.5% of this funding is going to purchase seafood. And even more recently, the Trump administration's executive order on restoring American seafood competitiveness, which both calls out NOAA fisheries to and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to think about the role of domestic seafood in our food systems. So all of these are motivation for this work. And my goal today is to provide a brief summary of our findings, starting with a review of the approach that we took. And so the first point to make here is that we focused on 4 agencies within the Department of Agriculture and specifically their grant-making programs. Clearly, USDA has many departments associated with it and does work that's broader than grant funding. It has technical assistance, it does food procurement, it does its own internal research. And so there are all kinds of different ways that the US Department of Agriculture invests in our food systems. Our focus was specifically on grant-making programs within 4 agencies within the department. And we focused on these particularly because they have a history of doing work related to local and regional food systems. So our first step was to develop a database to analyze, and we did that primarily by focusing on grants listed within USA Spending, which is an online portal for tracking government spending. We then complemented that with looking at agency-specific data portals around various grants. There's also information we were able to acquire on different web pages within the Department of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And then in some cases, we ended up making specific data requests to staff around specific programs that are in place. And through that process, we ended up generating a database that included information on the grant program area, the name of the organization that received the funding, the total amount of funding, the state, the year, the project title, and then the project description. Once we had that database, we went through a process of cleaning the data set, which primarily focused on making sure that the data set had the database had the information that we needed to be able to do this analysis. And one piece of this that I would call out in particular, we ended up removing data related to school lunch programs and supplemental nutrition programs. And a big part of that is that it wasn't possible for us to dissect where that funding was going to. It was going to various school programs. We knew that, but we didn't know, was it being used to purchase, say, apples versus beef versus seafood. And so we ended up holding aside those data sets. And then with the remaining data that we had in our database, we ended up doing writing code to do a keyword analysis. And then from that, we manually reviewed the results and then coded the data, looking at whether a grant was for aquaculture, wild capture, fisheries, or general seafood. And then also coding it based on the part of the supply chain the funding was going towards. Was it harvesters? Was it processing? Was it somewhere up the supply chain further? And then we also coded by organizational type. Was it a nonprofit? Was it a university? Was it a seafood company, and et cetera? And then to complement this quantitative analysis, we also did a set of interviews with grant recipients who had received USDA funding in the past for seafood projects. And this wasn't meant to be a representative sample, but to add richness, to add context to our understanding, to help interpret what we were learning from this analysis, and then also to develop a set of recommendations and understanding of how do we improve the system? How do we make, as Elizabeth said, funding opportunities more seafood friendly? So the database we built looks something like this. This is an example, one line of data. In this case, the agency is the Agricultural Marketing Services. The program is the Local Food Promotion Program. The funding was allocated in 2019. The state is Maine. We have an amount, we have an organization, a title, and a description. From that point, we then did this keyword scraping of the database for terms like seafood and fisherman and harvester and fishing vessel, et cetera. And so here I've highlighted some of those words that you can look at, and then we coded it. And so in this case, it's obviously it's relevant to seafood. The project is specific to the groundfish fleet here in Maine. So it's a wild capture fishery, and the organization that received the funding is a nonprofit. So this is kind of an example row of data for those who are data geeks and want to look at the data or build off of the data. It's available here on this QR code on the left, and there's on the right, the QR code leads you to a GitHub repository that's publicly accessible that has the code that we use to analyze the data set. So trying to make this available to those who want to build off of it, poke at it, look at it on their own. So what did we learn from this process? In total, we ended up looking at just under 150,000 grants that were awarded through almost 300 programs during a 6-year period from 2018 to 2023, totaling $31 billion. On any given basis or any given year, there's a bit over 20,000 grants awarded. And through time, you see that the total value of those grants increased by more than double, from a little under $4 billion to a little bit more than $8 billion. So what did we learn in terms of which are going to seafood versus aren't? Well, one thing, you see that there are substantial grants in all of these different agencies. Through time, the amount of money is increasing. One key point that I'd like to emphasize is that in all of these agencies, we observed grant funding going to seafood-specific projects. So there are programs within all of these agencies that allow for seafood entities to access grant funding. That being said, there is quite a bit of contrast between those focused on seafood and those other for other parts of the food system. We ended up identifying a little bit less than 800 grants totaling $261 million that were directed towards seafood-related projects. And that accounted for 0.5% of the total grants being allocated. So that's in contrast to the vast majority of the funding. We saw that the funding was allocated to most states. There are some exceptions in the sort of the Midwest where we didn't identify any seafood-specific grants. And those that are landlocked, a lot of that is around aquaculture and land-based kind of RAS-based systems. In terms of the amount of funding and how it's getting distributed across the seafood sector, we see that the total number of total value is increasing per year. And in general, the total number is also increasing for seafood-related projects. Within that, the large majority of those are going to aquaculture-related projects. And in lots of ways, that has to do with the history of USDA's investment in terrestrial ag and the equivalency with with aquaculture. And that's something we can talk more about. But the sort of the point here is most of the funding that is going to seafood has in the past gone to aquaculture. So then through a set of interviews that we did, as I mentioned, we asked people about their motivations for applying for funding, what's working, what's not. Here I want to describe some of the challenges that people identified. And I'm breaking this down as sort of defining them as speed bumps, sort of small speed bump, medium speed bumps, and more roadblocks that are impeding access to funding for the seafood sector. So the smaller speed bumps are around general accessibility. And I would argue that these aren't specific to the seafood sector at all. And my guess is for those who work within the US Department of Agriculture and in food systems more broadly, this kind of thing is well known and understood, but we heard these things within the seafood sector too. So some of the issues here, and this is not a complete list, these are just some of the examples, things like the time and cost of finding and applying for salient funding opportunities. There's a big cost. US Department of Agriculture is a complicated organization. It has a lot of different agencies within it. It's difficult to identify appropriate funding opportunities, and then it's complex if you get them to administer federal grants. So, those are some of the general accessibility issues that we heard. We also heard sector-specific barriers, and Linda touched on this some from her own experience applying to funding. But some of the examples of that are around definitions of local. A lot of seafood that happen in very rural places, and in some cases, USDA has definitions around that define what it means to be local, and that disqualifies a lot of folks in the seafood sector who live in rural and work and fish in rural places that are disconnected from urban centers or centers where there are consumers. We also heard about the disconnect between evaluation metrics and the lived experience of applicants. So our sense is that a lot of the evaluation metrics have been co-developed with the agricultural sector, but those kind of misapply to the seafood sector. And then there's just general confusion around whether or not seafood businesses or entities are eligible to apply. And some of that comes from, again, the distinction that we make between wild capture fisheries or aquaculture and the rest of the food system. And then the final ones that I point out are these sector-specific roadblocks or these kind of large speed bumps. Some of what we heard is there's a lot of misinformation about the seafood sector and how it functions, and that creates this really strong impediment to businesses and entities that focus on seafood getting access to seafood because grants are getting rejected because they're not understood or they're not eligible. And then this is specific to wild capture fisheries, but there are some grant programs that are simply not, wild capture harvesters are simply not eligible for. SARE grants, for example, amazing that they're open and available to the aquaculture sector, but they're not, as we understand it, available to wild capture, even though it's all part of the broader food system and seafood sector. So, and here with 3 takeaways from this work. One, USDA, which I think can be defined as our food system agency in the United States, has a clear track record of supporting fisheries and aquaculture across geographies, across their agencies, and across different parts of the supply chain. But consistent with other research, our finding does seem to underscore that there is an opportunity for better integration of seafood and the seafood sector into the more holistic food system funding opportunities that exist. And some of the recommendations that emerged from this work that we heard from people that we interviewed are that there would be value in a systematic review of grant programs to ensure that they're inclusive and salient to the seafood sector. There's also a need for investment in technical assistance and boundary organizations that can help the seafood industry navigate USDA and figure out how to link their experience to the opportunities that exist within USDA. And then finally, there's a real need for clarifying the eligibility for the seafood sector cross-grant programs. So I'll stop there, hand it back to Elizabeth, and really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation today.
Thanks so much, Josh. I mean, there's a lot there, and I'm actually going to just take a pause before we move on to our other panelists and just see, I think we have time for maybe just one or two questions, but if anyone's got any like burning immediate question, maybe clarifying the method used or the data they found and their conclusions, we've got time for a couple of questions. So feel free to drop it in the chat, or you could raise your hand and we can call on you. And if you're still digesting too, we will have time at the end for questions and discussions, because I know Josh just covered a lot. So, okay, hearing none. All right, we're going to move on then. So now that we've got a little bit more context on where USDA funding's been going, we're now going to hear from some of our local Catch Network members about what their own experience was like applying for USDA grant funding, navigating those processes, administering a federal grant as well, and just some of the lessons learned along the way. So we're going to first hear from Andrea Tomlinson. She's the founder and director of the New England Young Fishermen's Alliance, and she's going to share what she's learned through her experience with USDA. So Andrea, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see so many of our national colleagues all on this call. Welcome, everyone. Happy afternoon. I'm Andrea Tomlinson, and I have a really interesting story with my history with USDA funding. My journey started in 2019 when I was the general manager of the New Hampshire New Hampshire Community Seafood, which was a community-supported fishery here in New Hampshire that I ran for 7 years. And in 2019, it became very apparent to me that the graying of the fleet was dramatically affecting our fishing industry. So I hooked up with some colleagues at the UNH New Hampshire Food Alliance, which is a statewide collaborative organization that looks at all the different modalities for people getting food into consumers' hands here in New Hampshire. And I started meeting with a woman named Jennifer Wilhelm there as to how we could really start to work together to get some funding. So I told her, listen, we got to go big or go home, because what I want to do is start a New Hampshire Young Fishermen's Alliance. At the time, it was New Hampshire. So we looked around and, Jennifer was finding $25,000 grants, $30,000 grants. And I was like, that's not going big or going home. We have to go bigger. So I consulted with Josh, and he said, Josh Stoll, who just spoke, I'm a local Catch member for many years. And he said, why don't you start looking around at some of our members who've gotten USDA funding in the past? So I saw Alan Lovewell from Real Good Fish, which is a really popular and successful community-supported fishery in California, had gotten quite a bit of funding, I believe 2 grants consecutively. And I said, well, gosh, if Alan can do it, we can try. So we were really fortunate that my colleague at UNH had a friend who had just written a $16,000 USDA grant. And so she put her on to me. Her name's Jessica Gorhan. And Jessica taught me how to put fisheries language into USDA speak, which I feel is really necessary in order to have reviewers at USDA understand where you're coming from, because I'm really encouraged and really inspired to teach you how to be that 0.52% of USDA funding for wild caught fisheries. So we looked at the AMS grants, that's Agricultural Marketing System. That was on one of Josh's graphs. And those 2 big grants under the AMS are Local Food Promotion Program and Farmers Market Promotion Program. So we did scoping work in 2019. Obviously, you've got to come in with some, formidable data and proof of concept for your project. So we did scoping meetings in 2019 with young fishermen and women and their families, asked them what they would want from this type of organization and included that in our objectives. We submitted a grant in 2020. I was absolutely convinced we were going to get it. We did not. But the good news is Local Catch Network did. So Local Catch Network got a grant with USDA to help us fisheries organizations with technical assistance on being successful in our USDA grant applications. So I have to credit Josh Stoll with our success. Thank you, Josh. I was so discouraged. I said, I'm not applying again. I'm done. I'm done filing for these federal grants. It was a monster of a grant application. I'm not doing it again. And Josh said, please just reapply one more time. Just do it. And it was so helpful because Josh's work with USDA at the time was helping we fisheries organizations put ourselves in the right slot of funding that was available. And one little tweak with my local food promotion program application was we applied to farmers market promotion program the second time around, and we got it because if you've got to really distinctly read the objectives of the NOFO, the notice of funding opportunity, and make sure that your objectives for your project are fitting really distinctly into those objectives. So that was really helpful that Josh had done some fine tuning on, the objectives for the grant funding and then comparing it to the objectives of our project. I want to just really stress that if you do apply for a USDA grant and you don't get it, you have the right to ask for your internal reviews. And I did that and I found them really helpful. But the thing that was such a conundrum was all the reviews were very positive. So I called the USDA case manager who was assigned to our grant, and I said, I'm really confused. Why did we not get funded? Our reviews were fantastic. And what it ended up being is we were just on the wrong end of the bell curve. She said, Andrea, you were right along with a lot of the folks who got funded, but unfortunately, we only had so much money. The second time around, I want to encourage everyone to listen to this closely. Josh, through Local Catch Network, held several webinars for us, those of us who wanted to resubmit or submit for the first time. And a case manager for USDA looked right at me when I was asking a question and said, Andrea, we have the money to fund you. Just let me teach you how to get it. Okay, so that was an incredibly inviting challenge. So we did reapply in 2021. There was some extra COVID money put into that kitty with the AMS, and we applied to start the New England Young Fishermen's Alliance. It was comparable to what some of you know as a planning grant, but it was actually an implementation grant that we applied for, and the concept was to start the then New England Young Fishermen's Alliance, obviously to encompass more of a regional aspect to what we were trying to do, and to offer programming, which we're in our fourth year now, called Deckhand to Captain Training, and to also eventually develop a Greenhorn apprenticeship program. So in 2021, I'm very happy to tell you, with our USDA Speak application, we got $549,000 to start the New England Young Fishermen's Alliance. So if we can do it, you can do it. And I want to encourage everyone, if you can run a fisheries organization, if you can run a community-supported fishery, if you're an academic and you work with Sea Grant, you can write a USDA grant. So I appreciate the time to present our success to you, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And yeah, I think a really great example of not only can it be done, but it does take some persistence. It might take a few tries, but there are resources and support out there to help. So thank you for sharing. And yeah, we'll have a chance later at the end for folks to do follow-up questions with Andrea. And I know she's a lot more to share on that. We're next going to move on to Kim Selko with the Commercial Fishermen of Santa Barbara, and she's going to share what her experience has been like applying for USDA grant funding. And Kim, I will hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for including me on the panel. It's really an honor. I want to do a special shout out to South Carolina Aquarium Good Catch program, because a visit to South Carolina in 2004 was what inspired me to become a sustainable seafood educator and completely launched me on this path. And I don't know if it would have happened if I had never learned about that program. So super cool to see it still going strong. So I am trained as a marine ecologist. I did my PhD at UCSB, and I'd say that has been really critical to being able to become a really good grant writer, know how to administer grants, report on them, network through conference, circuits, like all of that, I think really helps with doing USDA grants. And I'd say one of the points I think of reflection and discussion that we can have is, how do we widen the circle? How do we allow folks who don't have a lot of grant writing skills, don't haven't done a lot of networking to access this and understand it. So I don't at all profess to be sort of the average, case of folks in my community who really want to write these grants. I've had a lot of specialized training, and that's really helped. I first applied for USDA grant with Alan Lovewell, so the common theme here. And that was because I wanted to start a CSF in Santa Barbara, and I met Alan at a conference. Another lesson is go to these conferences, build your network, build partnerships. And I didn't have an entity yet to submit the grant through. We hadn't formed a CSF yet. And so Alan agreed to submit it through his organization and be that lead who kind of gives us advice and guidance on how to start a CSF. And, the idea was, how can we measure whether a CSF can be started more quickly and more successfully if it's done within this sort of framework of CSFs helping each other out. So that all launched fairly well. Get Hooked Seafood resulted from it. It's still going strong. It started in 2019. And then I also wrote a USDA planning proposal. These were both, all of my writing through USDA has been through LFPP, the Local Food Promotion Program. So this was now for the commercial fishermen of Santa Barbara to do a planning grant, a feasibility study to create kind of a multifaceted training and resource center for seafood producers with our local community college. It took 2 tries, like Andrea said. We wrote a really strong proposal, but just had to get in line a second year to get that funding. That came in 2021, and it really was instrumental. I would say that, both like USDA grants are just so important to support efforts and businesses that are focused solely on selling local products, local seafood, because you just can't compete against the larger distributors and those who are, making their profits on selling cheap imports. And they might also support some local seafood, but they've got, this larger set of tools at their disposal. But when you really focus on just helping local communities, local seafood, we really do need the support of the federal government. So it's just been instrumental in all of the work I've done. I'd say the USDA staff is really fantastic at meeting applicants where they are. They're really patient when you have to submit one of these like SF 424 forms 5 times because you didn't get it to square with down to the cent. Or if you need to pivot. I think one of the things I've found in our fishing community is that there's a perception that grant funding means that you absolutely have to deliver down to the T on exactly what you proposed. And how do I do that? I can't guarantee that. There's all these factors outside of my control. A lot of stress, not knowing what to do, whether to admit that it's not going well. And I think it's really important to recognize that there's a lot of nuance to, you can pivot, you can recategorize, you can work with your program officer to share and problem solve. So I encourage folks to, take a breath, knowing that this isn't like signing on the dotted line and you have to kill yourself to get these things done. Like, you can redirect if things go awry. I have also tried the turnkey application, and personally, I felt like it was just as much work almost as the full application, because you really got to squeeze down what you want to do. And I think the competition's probably stiffer. And so I feel like that was a fantastic addition to the portfolio of the RFPs, but it also still maybe needs some work. I'd love to know more about like what the success rates and the number of applications are like for the turnkey applications versus the full application. I've had experience helping other folks in my community write LFPPs, and telling them repeatedly, we got to start early, this is going to sneak up on you. And they say, well, I can only work on this on like Sundays. Like that's the only day of the week I can do. And it just didn't come together because that just wasn't adequate. Or folks who, all of those tables, all those metrics, all the budget numbers, like they're not a numbers person. And that was too much for them. So I really recommend, if that's the case, to work with a professional grant writer. It might cost you $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, but it might be, a huge payoff in the end, especially if you think about you can reapply 1 or 2 years more if you don't get it the first time. Work with your SCORE, program locally of business mentors who help small businesses, to go through the numbers if needed, understand more about the budgeting process, obviously use local catch and all the technical assistance you can. And I would say that one of the things, I talked to another fisherman in my community that's gotten a lot of USDA grants, and his advice was like, is there a way that USDA could kind of create a pot of money for this grant writing support, to hire a grant writer for those who don't have the skills and don't have the time, maybe for folks who only have never gotten a federal grant before. Maybe that would be the kind of filter to allow folks to qualify. But, set aside some of the funding in the program, not just to make awards, but to create this, pool to help folks with grant writing. I also think that there's a need to kind of look at nonprofits, academic institutions, these boundary bridge organizations, what they're able to accomplish and what they're able to do with federal grant applications versus the average, farmers market participant, seafood harvester that really needs something way more streamlined, not just in the application, but also in the grant administration once you get it. And could there, right now we're all lumped together and it doesn't feel like a fair playing field. If there's some way to kind of create more of a distinction of like who's qualified to apply for which, it might, make those turnkey grants more successful and effective. I don't know, but I'll stop there. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Kim. Again, just really great insights and, what you learned through going through the process. And also, I think some real tangible, recommendations on what could be improved now that you've been through it a few times. So thank you. We're last going to hear from Noah Oppenheim with the Fishing Communities Coalition. And NOAA and FCC, they've been tracking the reauthorization of the Farm Bill for the last few years and have been helping lead efforts to ensure that, the seafood community and community-based seafood especially is part of the next Farm Bill. And, working to address the question or comment someone posted earlier in the chat of just like, how do we increase like that 0.5%? So Noah and others are working really hard to figure out how do we do that in some of the discussions happening right now in Washington, D.C. So Noah's going to give us an update on those efforts and sort of a landscape of where things stand and ways to be involved. So Noah, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thanks so much. It's an honor to be part of this panel and to be with all of you, Local Catch Network members, friends, and guests. I am Noah Oppenheim. I'm a policy consultant. My company is called Hamaris Strategies, based in Brunswick, Maine. And in that capacity, I have the pleasure of coordinating the Fishing Communities Coalition, which is a group of small-scale community-based fishing organizations around the country, two of whom I get to share this panel with, Linda and Andrea, and I see a few of our members are in the audience as well. Good to be with y'all. So yes, I am here to answer Melissa Mahoney's question in the chat. How can we fix this problem? I hope the answer, at least part of the answer, is obvious. Write a lot of grants and write really good grants. But there is another side to this coin, the coin. How are we going to appropriate funds and instruct the agency through Congress to open the door to the seafood industry at the USDA? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the context of the policy environment of today, And I'll talk about that from a few different angles. We'll talk about USDA, the agency itself. We'll talk about appropriations, and we'll talk about the so-called skinny farm bill, which is the vehicle by which policy changes could happen in Congress regarding USDA this fall. Just want to acknowledge this is a pretty wonky discussion. I'll be pretty pragmatic here, but these are wild times, and I want to acknowledge that the policy discourse here today, we have our blinders on while acknowledging that it's wild out there. And it's certainly wild for the USDA. Just setting the stage, the agency right now is in a state of, let's say, flux, with an announcement recently issued that the vast majority of the DC offices of the agency are going to be closed, perhaps with the exception of downtown headquarters, and they're going to be moving to Salt Lake City, Kansas City, Fort Collins, Indianapolis, and Raleigh, North Carolina. This is a radical transformation for the agency, and none of those cities are coastal. So we don't know where our issues would land, or if USDA contacts will be in one place or dispersed throughout this new constellation. That on top of cancellations of programs and other policy priorities that support commercial fishermen and seafood mean that it's a really challenging landscape. In the face of all that, Congress is continuing to appropriate funds for fiscal year 2026, the fiscal year that begins on October 1st, basically as if none of this is really happening. That's a gross generalization, but suffice it to say that Congress is not in the mood to cut these funds, and funding lines, budget lines for a lot of the programs that have been mentioned earlier are, fairly robust and healthy, and that's in both the House and the Senate. And so that's good news. Let's assume that Congress is going to keep the government running at some point at the end of September, when current appropriations expire. All signs point to a continuing resolution through the end of the year. And then it could very well be that fiscal year 26 appropriations move forward, and these programs are endowed, and the agency is instructed to spend money as Congress directs. The other side of USDA policy right now is driven by the Farm Bill. Now, y'all almost certainly remember budget reconciliation, the big beautiful bill passed along party lines earlier this year. That included the bulk of nutrition and row crop policy in the Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill is usually this sort of hodgepodge of nutrition programs and crop programs married together, and that's how the the grease of Congress is lubricating the process. Democrats traditionally arguing for strong nutrition programs, Republicans arguing for strong producer support and protection. Well, the nutrition part has basically been taken care of, and so a skinny Farm Bill is up. It'll probably deal with the ag titles, the Farm Bill titles sections of the bill that weren't already sort of dispensed with in budget reconciliation. I'll leave that there. It gets really complicated and sort of schoolhouse rockish. But feel free to ask more questions during the panel discussion. The Fishing Communities Coalition has developed 3 key policy priorities for this Farm Bill. And I think we developed them for 3 reasons. One is they are wins for small scale fishing communities. 2 is they are relatively low lift in this budget environment. Basically, the less you can propose programs that cost money, the better off you're going to be. And the third is they're all bipartisan. again, a plus in this policy landscape. The first is to expand agricultural and farm credit programs to commercial fishermen and seafood businesses. USDA provides low-cost capital in a variety of forms to businesses. Many of those programs are currently not available for seafood and fishing businesses. We're strong advocates for legislation, including the Fishing Industry Credit Enhancement Act, sponsored by Senator King of Maine and supported strongly by the Alaska delegation. We also support the establishment of an Office of Seafood or a seafood liaison at the USDA. Now, this is a key opportunity to have a dedicated staff member at the USDA working to promote accessibility of USDA programs to our industry. Brilliant. Let's get it done. The Senate has funding for this position in USDA approps for fiscal year 2026. The House does not. Let's work on the House and change that. And we can talk about how you can figure out whether you as a constituent might have an opportunity to work with your member of Congress on this particular issue. Our third policy priority is expanding grant eligibility for those programs that have their door shut, either through ambiguity or straight up lack of statutory authorization. Seafood and fishing businesses are ineligible for some USDA grant programs. We want to change that. Senator Murkowski has introduced the Working Waterfronts Act last year, and then again this year. It's S 1968. Section 201 of that bill would open the door. We love this language. It would do a whole lot to take care of Melissa's question. How are we going to get more than that 0.5%? So how do we make hay? How do we work together as a coalition or yourselves individually as businesses to engage on this? Time is of the essence. The skinny farm bill is probably going to be marked up at the end of September or early October. So we've got to move quick. The Fishing Communities Coalition is moving on this, and we're happy to help others sort of amplify the messaging that we're doing. I personally would be happy to help amplify your strategy development, and my info is now in the chat. The appropriations process, again, like I said, likely to be drawn out through the fall and into the early winter potentially, but never too early to start advocating for that seafood liaison position in the House and keeping that strong language in the Senate. And then for access to credit programs, that's a combination of engagement with the agency itself, which the FCC is doing, and then supporting the legislation that can authorize these changes of the program. Like it has been said already by Josh and others, it is now the policy of the United States to develop an America First seafood strategy. There are engagement opportunities both at NOAA and ostensibly in the future at USDA. Let's all take advantage of those, flood the zone, and make sure that your voice is heard. I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to your questions and working together on all of these really important policy opportunities. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Noah, for the really helpful summary of what's happening in DC during these really dynamic times. And as Noah said, like now is the time, to really help educate Congress on why seafood matters, the role it plays in our food system, and specific ways we can increase the USDA's investment in community-based fisheries. So yeah, super, super timely, and definitely Noah's laid out some good marching orders for us. And, we can spend some time digging into what that looks like. And he's shared his info too, so you can be in touch with him. He's a tremendous resource. Well, at this point, we're going to open it up for questions and discussion. I mean, we've covered a lot here in the last, 50 or so minutes as far as how much. First of all, just a huge thanks to all of our panelists for taking the time and sharing their experience in navigating USDA and also their efforts to help make it accessible to others and share. I mean, as you've heard, we've got tremendous resources here and just experts, Linda and Andrea and Kim, a lot of good resources to tap into. So please keep in touch. Have just shared their contact info in the chat. So we know we're kind of just scratching the surface here, but look forward to more discussions with you all on this topic. Please reach out if you want to get involved and learn more. Also do a quick plug for the upcoming local seafood summit in Gulf Shores, Alabama. Being together in person is a great place to, share ideas, building these coalitions, building collaboration. Those are the places where that magic happens. So hope to see you all there. And just thanks again so much for joining us and for your interest in this topic. So with that, have a great rest of your day. And we'll be sending out a follow-up email too with contact info, a link to the recording and other resources as well. But thanks again.